So a short video today on how an economist thinks about immigration and why they get it wrong so often. Now the context here is that you'll often hear in the media, particularly a popularization of a theory that immigration is good economically for us as countries and nations, particularly in the first world. Then you have an adamant part of the population that is obsessed with diversity as a concept, and that an increase in this diversity metric is just positive, positive, positive. More foods, vibrancy, things like that. I have no idea. Anyway, the understanding there is obviously a much more social one. So what the challenge here today, in this video at least, is to combine the economic and socio part of the equation into a socio-economic review of immigration. And the way that we can do that is obviously start with the numbers, and we can say, are immigrants better or worse for us as first world economies, and what exactly the implication is if they're worse, and then also socially, what does that mean? The analysis here is basically to guide the principle of immigration policy. Now, immigration policy is fairly complex in the way that there's, for any given Western country, something like 15 to 25 visas that are on offer for differing purposes, whether they be for asylum seekers and refugees all the way through to study visas, holiday visas. So you have a gamut of all these different options that allow for visitors to come into countries. Particularly if you're in the EU, you have certain allotments for both student places across the EU, but also inter-EU travel now is obviously visa-free, which has its own sort of ramifications. But in this sense, I think it's best if we start with a case study, and one of the most popularized or famous ones out of The Economist here is the Danish case of net contribution. So a 2018 study here allows us to look at what we can consider is the net fiscal contribution, which is more or less, if you earn money and thereby paying tax, would you contribute in total net or net negative towards the broader economy, into, you could say, society in general, because obviously a taxpayer base is what's allowed for the continual growth and prosperity in our countries in the first world, and it's why third world countries are still rather awful, is because they don't have a middle class paying a large amount of tax. They don't have companies trying to pay certain taxes, payroll taxes, but also company tax rates. So the idea here is that we all contribute towards a certain goal around prosperity, and that can be both material and otherwise. The Danish case, as you can see though, is hugely important in understanding how certain immigrants are not the same as others. So the two differentiating factors here are the requests on immigration from a person who has been educated, been to university, and wants to be what would be called a qualified worker in a more sophisticated realm. That's doctors, lawyers, engineers, things like that. Then you have the other side of immigration, and this is agnostic to where you're from. It's more around what skills you bring, and which is to say you have low skill or no skill NEET and or peasant classes. So you would not want to encourage peasant classes necessarily to immigrate to a country that has a high social burden. You have the idea that there's a safety net in a lot of these first world countries whereby you're helped with housing and a stipend if you're poor. However, the idea is that it's an allowance to get you back on your feet, and you would then pursue work and at some point start paying tax again. We have this psychological safety feeling from some extant systems like this, and which is why we've instituted them over the course of the last 100 years. Now, if you're from a poor country, all you see is free money. The government is willing to pay you what would be 5x your salary in your home country for doing nothing in another country. So the incentivization is obviously very fiscal. It's pecuniary reward for just moving to another place. If my life sucks back home, then it can still suck in my new place, but I'll be earning 5x more. This is their mindset, at least. There's no inclusion around cost of living and the other social implications of this. It's just how they breed the idea inside and germinate it. Which is to say that obviously now when we look at destination of origin, so the idea is that you've gotten a visa for either skilled work or other, and other being everything else where you have an allowance for people from less skilled backgrounds, which is obviously necessarily going to cause problems with the social system. And we can see that clearly here, that MENAPT immigrants and non-Western immigrants are almost always net negatives on the budget for a country, and that they require us to basically take away tax from the native born and or other Western immigrants, particularly with Denmark being in the EU. You have a quite diverse workforce from, say, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, things like that. So they're all net contributors, tend to be, and they'll also probably fit in socially, but we can go into that later, because of the way that their societies are structured very similarly to Denmark's in regards to European values. So economically, I think the first real point is that if we have encouraged, which we have in the past, immigration from countries where the values around paying taxes and working hard in jobs aren't necessarily, as Weber would put it, Protestant work ethics, but they're more around, you could say, milling and luxuriating, or some lackadaisical effort and galvanization towards working is just absent from this mindset. There's no feeling of social guilt or shame around contributing or not, and if anything, it's probably glorified that you're able to take advantage of certain systems because that's just how they work in their home countries, and that's their values, and that's how they typically see things as being fair and equitable, is that if I can take advantage of it and so can you, then me taking advantage of it is the natural, and this is what they call the tragedy of the commons, whereby if we're all trying to scramble and steal as much as possible from what is the common wealth, then we're all worse off because we've not actually built something sustainable. And this is what you get with these MENAPT immigrants. It's a fairly easy case to make, and it makes a lot of sense from a financial standpoint. The Economist, and this is where they will trick you when they publish papers and research studies, is they will go, if we look at fiscal contribution, then we'll roll it all up into one big bundle and we'll say, look how much fiscal contribution there is from different parts of the economy becoming citizens and thereby paying taxes. This one I think is from America, and it's in relation to having basically South Americans and mostly Mexicans citizenship, and then say, yes, now they're citizens, they'll have to pay tax. So aren't we so much better off giving them citizenship? Look at this. Obviously discounting completely the net contribution of them from a totality, whether it's healthcare, education costs, childcare, child rearing, and anything related to public infrastructure, then becomes what you would see basically here is this net negative. And now people will object and say that maybe Mexicans are hardworking people, but that's not how you calculate a net contribution. Just because someone works hard, if they're earning minimum wage for their entire lives, they're going to probably be a net drain on a society from a fiscal standpoint because of the inability for them to pay taxes, which would cover both their pre-working age from 0 to 18 and then also their post-working age when they're retired. And there's also a lot of different factors that go into that. But if we can just, in a general sense, understand how the government borrows money against future growth of their GDP, but you won't have growth in a real sense, so that's adjusted for inflation, like we've seen in the UK, there's been an actual decrease, and so our ability to pay back debt has worsened, if anything, in the future. So the calculation here is always disingenuous, I think, for economists, because they don't have to live with the realities of their recommendations or their analyses. Economists in general are quite unscrupulous or amoral people, because they always consider humans as numbers in a mechanistic functional sense, as in I can put X bucket of people into a model and they'll give me X number of dollars coming out, or necessary utility functions, which is why they have a bad reputation, and I think it's warranted. I would say then that once we can establish the inability for certain immigrants from certain backgrounds to ever be net fiscal contributors, we would also have to start to think that attracting skilled labor from underdeveloped countries is a way of those countries never developing themselves. So it's called brain drain. But in general, if you are saying, yeah, we'll happily take all your PhDs from Indonesia, then Indonesia is not going to have enough smart people left to actually help their countries develop. They're just going to continually be pilfered and purloined, in which the Western world gets a economic and you could call it IQ advantage. And this is very Western in that we always seek to, and particularly Faustian Viking sense, pillage and steal as much as possible in terms of value. We value high functioning, high intelligence a lot nowadays, particularly in the industries around engineering and technology, healthcare. And so what we can see is that when you look at, and it's fairly evident just from a small case like the Math Olympiad, that the teams are made up mostly of first, second, third generation immigrants who have moved to places like America and the UK and then been pushed really quite hard into subjects like maths and science. And from that, you're basically getting this misbalancing of the equation of what we used to call a competitive advantage, in that some countries were better at doing some things and others were better at others. And so eventually the circular economy would balance in ways that we see China makes all of our cheap crap, but we were able to make the more expensive things, and then thus the balance of trade would match. Whereas now obviously we're stealing people more or less by enticing them with money, and then those countries obviously have no infrastructure, and this is from a human resource perspective, to develop themselves. A super added effect here, which is not, I would say, orthogonal, is that you have a cultural and cross-cultural interlinkage which needs to be understood and then evaluated, and that has to be necessarily done in concurrent to doing a fiscal or economic analyses. And that's a funny way of saying that we have a look at some cultural dimensions here around how close some countries are to one another. Stealing this off some chap on Reddit who was able to compile what I think is a fairly reasonable attempt at looking at the similarities between different countries. And you can see here he took 20% of demographics, 20% culture, 20% government, 20% infrastructure, and 20% geography around how close and how similar these countries are to one another. And as you can see, the Anglo-Germanic, Teutonic, Faustian world here, you can cut it off right here in Germany, all the way out to America, Canada, and then Australia, New Zealand, more or less, represents what we would consider the first world and 70% of the economic value of the global output. Almost every innovation, every invention, every important happening or cultural event comes out of these countries. The rest of this world basically exists to serve this one, and such that we've set up culturally a not very reciprocal relationship whereby we take almost everything from all of these people, and in return they get a paltry sum, usually of money, which is why there's such resentment. Now you could say, too bad, so sad, and I would agree with you. It's that all these countries here have had opportunities to join the first world using their own civilians and citizenry in ways that profits them. And so we can see from the Asian tigers, but necessarily Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, countries like this who have striven to actually develop themselves rather than relying on handouts and relying on, you would call it, this cronyistic, nepotistic, self-servicing way of building economies, whereby I'm employing only my family members. And you can see this still quite strongly in Asia, but obviously much more common throughout South America and Africa. So understanding that, we have set up a really quite concrete divide between the first world and the rest. We then understand why everyone wants to come to these countries, from both a fiscal and economic, but then also the soft power, which is to say America produces almost all media worth watching, listening, reading, and from that you drown all these other countries in their cultural sense away, out from under. Like, you basically heap upon them copious amounts of your own media to the degree that they become indoctrinated in America is the global power, look how good it is, look how amazing it is, my life would be perfect if I could go to America and live there. And this is such a strong cultural force. It stems from such, you would say, insignificant things like local dietary and product food choices, all the way through to something like pornography, where the entire system is run by either through an American prism or it is run by an American company. Which is to say, it's a pollution almost effect where it's permeated across and outwards on every single part of the life or your existence in terms of your interaction with the things that you have in your local socio-cultural sense. Obviously the biggest problems for countries differ. So Canada, for instance, is having large problems from what you would call Hindustan here, where you have a large amount of non-integrating immigrants, which is further ironic because the existing second generation immigrants in Canada don't like this, but they obviously have lost it on themselves that they were the problem for last generation, in the sense that no one feels like they are the antagonist. You're always the protagonist in your own narrative. But without first generation immigrants and subsequent negative impacts towards the cultural close-knitted, you could call it a monolithic cultural perspective, you degrade and you more or less eat away at the essential pillars of the society by including immigration from these and you say colloquial, but necessarily similar countries. And with Australia, you have obviously slightly different problem, even though India still represents quite a strong immigrant calculus for Australia. You also have China and Southeast Asia here. So the dilution effect of your local culture becomes even more apparent and stronger with the more diversity you have, and that this melting pot is obviously farcical, and that immigration becomes almost perfunctory in the way that visas are given out for reasons like family reunification. And if you've had 6 kids and you have 5 grandparents and uncles and cousins, then you're talking, say, 15 visas to one person sometimes. And from that, we can obviously see such a strong growth in the number of people in these countries, but also the diverse backgrounds and then the problems subsequently that they bring. So, and when we talk problems, we're not talking just economic here, where we can clearly find evidence for a net fiscal impact. So not only do they drain the systems they're immigrating to, they're also worse for crime, typically, particularly from, so if you've got an associated net negative fiscal contribution, you're also more likely to be from a demographic that's highly represented in prisons, also other negative social impacts. But then there's softer, you might call them cultural dimensions here, and we can look at what Hofstede said, but there is a general sense that the West is very individualistic, and so if you come from a collectivist society like India or China, then you will be in stark contrast to the local populace, and it won't mean you integrate ever. There is an inability to perform the same functions necessarily so, and it's demonstrable from the way that these cultures interact on a global stage. You would have to be mad to not understand this. There's also a strong difference between how we treat women and men, and that the equality in the Western European countries is obviously so high that men and women both feel free to be able to choose and do what they want, contrasted to something like Afghanistan, where there's a recent devolvement, you could say, from women's right perspective, that they're not allowed to speak to any other men, and they're not allowed to speak, I think, in public in general, and they're not allowed to look at any male who's not a relative. So you can obviously see that that's quite a toxic environment for a woman to exist in. But funnily enough, the most immigrants the West gets from Afghanistan are men between the age of 18 and 45, so which you would think is sort of ironic, given that the most oppressed gender is women, and necessarily that the women that do immigrate will always bring their husbands, so you're just reinforcing this poor cultural understanding of how the interrelationship is going to, well, function but not function. I think the last few are also important, which is to understand the time perspectives that some cultures live on, and that the indulgence or restraint, and that what is fun for some countries, for some people in some countries, and what is a long time and a short time can vary quite significantly. And you can think of countries like China as having these quite long time horizons. Even their public policy are done on 5-year increments, where they have great plans for 5 years, and then they obviously are able to enact what those policies are, and then move on to the next plan, which is quite a good way of building a more sustainable economy and society. Contrasted to different cultures in Africa, which have almost no concept of time, and short term is everything in terms of what am I going to eat today is decided today, what I'm going to do for work tomorrow will be tomorrow's problem. And this mindset is not something that just vanishes when they turn up in a Western country. You can't unindoctrinate people because this is blood deep. It's something that's intrinsic to them. Westerners, in their folly, have typically come out with this everyone is equal mindset. Thank you, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where we've said, yes, of course, everyone can learn the same habits, and habits in the Peircean sense of things that I'll do to conjure a result that I want. However, obviously we understand that that's not true, and that there's a range of deleterious outcomes socially from these countries and the way that they treat their long-term vision of what will I be doing in 5-10 years, will I retire, will I need to build a pension pot, etc. So the inability for the we could call a confluence of these ideals to match the country that they're supposedly trying to integrate to just allows for this, you could call it a not fallacious, but it's definitely a misnomer, or it's a way of generating an idea that's not representative of any reality. We have just come to a point where we're talking around subjects rather than addressing them, because the way that we fundamentally built them and the presuppositions that we have used have been erroneous, and they're not things that represent any reality. Public policy throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s was done through just goodwill and the sense that we had to stop communism at any costs necessary. But what that has resulted in is a runaway economic socio-system which reflects only a number on a screen going up versus the Soviet required state planning. So we wanted to counteract that with capitalism, which we did. But capitalism has no restraint when it comes to economic activity unless the state imposes it. So capitalists will continue to align capital in any way possible to return more money. So if that includes allowing more consumers into an economy, then that's a good function of that calculus. However, obviously we know that just because you increase a certain number of people, an economy as a totality is not better off, and that borrowing and other social standards will drop. Obviously this is not a consideration when we look at most politicians, because politicians are very bad at economics, and they're also bad at understanding historical context. What politicians are good at is speaking in sound bites and addressing the media in ways that wins them elections and or brownie points in a very short 2 to 3 year window. That's why there's such a high turnover of politicians, and why their acumen and their adroitness is so poor when it comes to actual governance, is because politicians in general are being, you could say, positive sample bias, but chosen specifically for skills not required by governing and being an actual statesman, but are more associated to party politics, which is a very internecine and small-minded way of operating daily to win party favour, to be able to be pre-selected or to be able to run a ticket or something like that, which is obviously, once again, it requires a lot of energy and intelligence to do certain specific things, but that has no relation to how you would then, after winning power, govern a country. And so we can, I guess, end by just having a look at, if you were to say immigration was good, it's perspective based, dependent on where you are. So if you are a Frenchman living in France, you can for sure say that if you are to continue taking and accepting immigrants from those MENAPT countries that we've highlighted, you will continue to see net negative contributions, both fiscally but then also socially. You'll strain on your prison systems as well as any other type of healthcare. Education is less important, because unless you're under age of 18 as a first or second generation immigrant, it's unlikely you'll pursue education anyhow. But the interactivity with police and other emergency services will be higher than the native population, and there'll be further strains on other parts of the economy. Which is I guess, a very long-winded way of me saying that immigration is super contextually dependent and just can't be a general, generic, broad-brushed stroke of yes, immigration good, yes, immigration bad. It's such a complex topic that you need to be very educated, and you have to request specific language to be used in certain policies to understand the actual implications and what a policy decision will mean for the West, particularly going forward in the next 5 years.